And what Hogarth did is he went to the Parliament and he got them to change the law so that it was extended to include engravings, and it was the Engravers Copyright Act, which was passed on the 25th of June 1735, and that was the day, 6 months later, that he actually first published these works. So there is a sort of, we're listening to a very interesting talk about, music and all this stuff. There's quite a lot of parallels here. Okay, let's check. Right. For those of you who came to the Best of British, which was about 6 months ago, I did show you these slides. I particularly like these slides, so indulge me if you would. I shall show you the before and after, because what Hogarth really hated was the absolute obsession with the British public in buying foreign paintings and not actually buying home-painted artists, British artists. And in particular, he now attacks the Fête Galante, which is a movement, the Festival of Gallantry, which is sort of depicted by this tripe. It's just sentimental mush. It's a couple of, young lovers being watched by goats and stuff. I mean, it's just horrible, and frankly, I don't blame him. So he did his own, which was before and after. And this is in the style of the Fête Galante. As you can see, he is wooing her. She's rather coy about the whole thing. That's before. I guess after. This is 18th century. This is 18th century, remember. I mean, thankfully, the position is such that she's maintaining a bit of decorum, but as you can see, if you look at his breeches, there's not much left for the imagination in this. So what he was doing was he was not afraid in the least to break the rules and to push the boundaries. Here's, again, an attack on politicians. In this, you've got the Whig Party, which are the Liberals. Outside, you've got the Tory Party, which are obviously the Conservatives, wandering around. And they're in the process of wining and dining, bribing, and getting extremely drunk. A brick has just come through and knocked this guy out so that he's having alcohol poured. This boy is making sure that there's plenty of ale left for those who are revelling. And I thought I wanted to include that because it's so relevant to what was going on before the last the government before the election, in terms of the attack that are being made to our politicians, to politicians all over the world, and it really is no different. It was never, it wasn't that different 250 years ago. So I used William Hogarth as an example because, in my opinion, in his art, he was an innovator. He surprised people, he amused people, he was highly talented, and he was absolutely irreverent at every stage. He mastered the art form, and then he subverted it. And my argument then, and still is that that's actually exactly why in the UK we tend to be good at writing games, and indeed inventing things and many of the art forms. And if you think of something like Grand Theft Auto, that is very much the equivalent of this sort of thing. And APB releases today, I think we wish those guys all the best of luck. It releases in the US. But it was a time, the 18th century, a time of changing public attitude and perception toward art. And as I said, people wanted to own it. They wanted to have it in their houses. And the parallel with us, I think, is quite clear in that, as again was being talked about earlier, the public change the perception, their own perception of what they want. And I think in the games industry, we need to be very careful, because certainly my opinion is that we used to have a fairly eclectic group of gamers as such in the 80s, and then Sony, who were brilliant when they introduced the PlayStation, decided that actually moving forward it was all going to be 3D and it was going to be much more visceral games, and alienated a whole swathe of people who have only recently come back in again, and we call them the casual gamer, for whatever. And what's really been driving the dynamics of the market, in my opinion, is this sort of hardcore who were the Sony generation and the new people coming in. And they create opportunities if people are prepared to innovate. Not quite relevant, but it's such a lovely quote, and I think it's so important, I'm going to mention it, that about 10 years ago, I remember Electronic Arts saying that they'd reached a point where they could spend marketing to inform people about the existence of a product, but they could no longer spend marketing money to change people's minds. And it struck me that that was a really important moment in time, because it actually meant that however much money you had, it didn't mean you could buy the market. And that is really why there are so many small developers who can come in and succeed, and indeed so many small bands, because it doesn't, all you can do with your money is educate people faster. You can't actually make them want the product necessarily. Also in the 18th century, it was a time of great disruption in terms of technology. Printing was becoming a lot cheaper, which is why Hogarth could then pull away and print himself. And there was better distribution, and of course we have the equivalent of digital and the broadband here. But of particular interest, he was appalled at how the writers were treated by the booksellers, and he pioneered the new model. He disintermediated, and by selling directly to the fan base, he got straight into retail rather than having to go through the booksellers, rather than having to go through the publishers. He sold his subscription 50% in advance, 50% on delivery. And like him, we have in games very low variable costs, high fixed costs, but very low variable costs. And I often wonder whether we could do the same thing, whether we could leverage our fan base to actually pay something in advance in return for joining the fan club and then getting something at the end. And I was very interested that a company, Vertigo Films, who produce low-budget films, did exactly this. And I really ought to try and find out how successful they were. But they specifically got money from their fans so that it would fund future projects. Or indeed, as was being said earlier, Radiohead with their fantastic example of giving away their album and saying, in rainbows, and saying, pay what you want. And the interesting thing about that, of course, is that because, again, it's digital, it's low variable cost, it costs nothing to them for somebody to download it if they wouldn't have bought it in the first place. And then they went and they sold, and those who would have bought it paid, those that didn't spread it, and of course they kept the box copy, the box version, the expensive version for their hardcore fans. And I think in the games industry, we're also talking about piracy, and that's very important. And as I said, he lobbied Parliament, he got the laws changed. We've obviously always had the law on our side, but I think like him, what he did is he built a reputation from which he could leverage and persuade people to buy directly from him. And obviously that's something that we want to do in the games industry. And following on from what was said before, I think there are actually three key areas. One is building respect with your audience, and you do that by communicating with them directly. And I actually think the artist is in a much better position to do that than the record label, because I think people don't really care too much about being perceived to steal from a record label, whereas if they have a direct association with the artist, then they do. I think price is very important, or rather the perceived price of what the public think a game is worth. And there's a lot of pressure on video games at $30, $40. A lot of people don't think that that they should have to pay that much. And then also the ease of access. And iTunes have been absolutely brilliant. They made it so easy to actually to buy songs. And in the same way that Hogarth just shipped these things straight into your home once you'd subscribed. He was also a great believer in the value of collaboration. As well as other artists, he met with David Garrick, after whom the Garrick Club in London is named, who was an actor and also a playwright, and the writers Henry Fielding and, of course, Lawrence Sterne, who wrote Tristram Shandy. And I'd like to think that part of Tristram Shandy and its madness came from all these amazing people coming together and sharing ideas. And it meant that Hogarth would go off in one direction with his etchings and his paintings, and Lawrence Sterne would go off another and produce books like Tristram Shandy. And certainly, in times of rapid change, there's undoubtedly a lot more to be gained from people exchanging ideas than from people keeping ideas to themselves. And indeed, an event like this is all about sharing ideas. And I think people, particularly in the games industry, are very happy to really talk about anything and not hold back, and that's great. Certainly last year, I was very impressed by I have to say I hosted it, so I would be, but the event, some of you remember when we were talking about marketing, and we had Mark Morris from Introversion talking about the way he'd built a relationship with his audience on the website, Martin Brown and the way that he was exploiting worms, and Paul Farley from TAG, who was talking about street teams and beta testers and with his Carjack Streets. And from my perspective then, that was incredibly useful to go on and launch Broken Sword on iPad and iPhone. And the games me, we've sold about 150,000. A lot of the success of that came from just listening to what people had done it before. So listen to people, talk to people, and spread the information. And then we also need to be a little bit aware of the threats as well. The first one is that At the moment, it's a time of amazing opportunities. Don't think it'll last forever. It won't. To go back to the Hogarth analogy, the business of bookselling changed to be controlled by the publishers towards the end of the 18th century. A few of them exist today. Companies like Constable still are very successful today, but they basically saw where the money was and slowly pulled it in. Again, they controlled the choke points. They made sure the distribution had to come through them. And then from a technology point of view, photography started to emerge at the beginning of the 19th century. And that meant that previously engraving was the only way that you could put images into print. As photographs took over, so engraving became less relevant. And also, rather sadly, we'll go on to the next one. Also, rather sadly, Hogarth's personal aspirations, to begin with, clearly he had an absolute love for his art, but he decided that actually he wanted to compete in the high arts. He wanted to prove that he was as good as the grand Italian masters. And he produced this particular painting towards the end of his life, and he was widely ridiculed for it because it didn't reach the qualities of the Italians. The man who commissioned it rejected it, and Hogarth was ridiculed. Of course, as soon as he died, or very shortly thereafter, he was absolutely revered, and the quality of his work was acknowledged. So, in conclusion, thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about my favourite British artist, and I accept that it is a lot of self-indulgence, but I hope that the sort of slightly tenuous connections, made some sort of sense. I hope that really, the big parallel really is on deciding how you can creatively innovate in the areas that are relevant, the artistically, technically, commercially. Hogarth made his fortune using a new art form to depict moral tales in a way that was shocking and provocative and different. And I think that we do that in games, and if we don't, we should be, because that's actually what people want. That's what the audience wants. And in many ways, I think that we are doing the same. And so I'll leave you with two things. If you have any interest in Hogarth, then the Tate Britain is running a great exhibition, and otherwise the Soane Museum has some wonderful, they have the original paintings of the Rake's Progress. What the artists used to do is they used to paint them first, and then from the paintings they'd create the etchings. And so you can see the two side by side. Lovely, thank you very much.